Well, one nation, one tax, one market. That's what we're really looking for. GST going to be announced at midnight with that ringing of a gong. And joining us now, one of the country's top economic thinkers, Bibek Debroy, who's of course a member of the NITI Aayog as well. So, Professor Debroy, when you look at the preparedness right now, I mean, we're really hearing two views. A lot of people excited and saying this is the biggest single tax reform in independent India, which is perfectly true. Others are saying there'll be lots of people who are not prepared and maybe we're not completely ready, which may well be true as well. So, how are you seeing this?
Well, firstly, look, this is the beginning of a process. GST means a single unified tax which eliminates all indirect taxes other than the GST, with everything under the tax net with a single rate. That's what an ideal GST is. This is not an ideal GST. There are too many rates, there are still exemptions. So therefore, both the positives that you hear about, which are more in terms of the ideal GST, and the negatives that you hear about, both are somewhat exaggerated. The way I look at it is that this is the beginning of a process. We have been debating it, discussing it for the last 17 years. There will be problems, we will learn as we go along. The GST Council, I'm sure, will tweak things as we go along. We should applaud it because it's the start of a process. A proper GST in most countries in the world has taken several years.
Right. Professor Debroy, so that's what we are also hearing from many people. I've been talking to many of the people who are behind the GST, who've been working closely, including at the Finance Ministry earlier in the day where everyone was quite excited. They essentially seem to be saying, look, don't make the good the enemy, the perfect the enemy of the good. Let's start off with GST. Let's go ahead with whatever there is. And even this GST, which you yourself said is not the perfect or the ideal GST, is still better than what we've had in the past. Would you agree with that? And if so, perhaps you could help us understand what we are implementing as of midnight today. How is that better than what we've been doing so far? In which all ways?
Well, there are several ways I can react to that. Firstly, let's recognize that there aren't too many countries in the world that have a GST. There are several countries in the world which have a VAT, which is part of the GST structure, but it is not a complete GST. The number of countries in the world which have a proper GST are very limited, probably about 7 or thereabouts. Out of these 7, there is only one other country which has anything like a federal structure, and that is Canada. And even in Canada too, provinces are not integrated into the part of the GST network. The reason I'm belaboring this point is that India has a federal structure. There is a union government, there are the state governments. It is not a situation where the union government can administer and implement a GST according to what it thinks best. Hence, we have the GST Council, and the moment you recognize this, you begin to appreciate that there are bound to be compromises. The views of the states will have to be taken on board, and that is the reason we have some of these exemptions and some of the deviations in terms of rates.
So, if you're looking at the possible compromises that ideally should not be there. So, you've got multiplicity of rates. Ideally, we shouldn't have 7 rates. Ideally, you shouldn't have a large number of areas being kept out of GST, as is the case right now. And ideally, you should try and have had a slightly simpler nomenclature, if nothing else, for the many returns that people are going to have to file. Those are structurally some of the things that perhaps could have been fixed. And then, of course, training and teaching people how to use it and how to implement it, which I guess would always be a problem. No matter when you're implementing it, there will be people who will be struggling on the last day to come up to terms with it.
I will divide what you said into 2 parts. Firstly, obviously, I agree that no matter how wise the government think it is, there will always be unanticipated problems. And therefore, one has to tweak, the GST Council has to tweak as one goes along. It is impossible to anticipate every possible problem under the sun. And of course, there will be problems. Having said that, I will separate my reactions to what you said into 2 things. One is, in the existing system, greater clarity is required about several issues, and those I'm sure will have greater clarity in the next few months or so, because the GST Council has been meeting. I understand it's meeting even today and will continue to meet. The second kind of response is something that is a bit more structural in nature, in the sense that we want more items, petroleum products, natural gas, all of real estate, tobacco, liquor, all of those also part of electricity, all of those also part of the GST structure, and we want a movement towards perhaps at best 3 rates, hopefully 2. That's not going to happen in a hurry. That will take a little bit of time until states and everyone is assured that there aren't going to be revenue losses.
Right. So the structural issues, you're saying, yes, it should be there, and you're agreeing with what a lot of people have been saying. Let's not have 7 rates, let's have only 2 rates or maybe 3 rates, not more than that. But you're saying maybe that's something which we should move towards. Now, getting the confusion sorted out, because many traders in particular are saying we're not yet completely sure. There are some people who are saying we don't have IT, we don't know how to operate the computers, we're not tech savvy enough to do this. Was there anything in retrospect you would have done differently in the build up to today to maybe spread more awareness and information, or do you think a lot has been done?
No, not from the point of view of the government. I think what has happened is a lot of people did not expect this deadline to be adhered to, because deadlines have come and gone in the past. There was an original deadline in 2010. After that, there was another deadline in 2012. And therefore, by the way, discussions, consensus building, awareness, all of these have been going on for almost 17 years now. I think what has happened is some segments of industry, trade and industry, did not really believe that 1st July was going to happen, and therefore they dilly-dallied, and they are now caught because they are not ready. So far as the government is concerned, governments I should say, it's not just union governments, state governments also, to some extent local bodies as well, I think the IT backbone is in place, but obviously there will be issues as one implements. Because of the multiplicity of rates, there will also be legal cases, but those are glitches which are bound to happen.
All right, can I just ask you one last question on the impact on the economy? Now, unlike demonetization, of course, which was more of a surprise here, as you're rightly saying, many people may not have believed or expected that, yes, that deadline is going to be kept till 1st of July, but it is happening now. The impact of this on the economy itself. We've been hearing about talk of short-term pain, which will eventually be mitigated, and there'll be lots of long-term gains, which is probably perfectly true. How much short-term pain are you actually anticipating in the next few weeks or months?
Well, I'll hedge a bit, not that I want to duck the question, but I'll hedge a bit because we, as I said earlier, we don't have a perfect GST. When you hear people citing increments to GDP growth of 1.5% or thereabouts, that is based on an ideal GST on the basis of a model that NCAR had worked out. We are nowhere near that, and therefore, on the positive side, the gains will not be that much. As I said, it's the beginning of a process. It's going to take almost 10 years. And similarly, on the flip side, the negatives are also being somewhat exaggerated. I do think that there will be transition pains. I do think that the transition pains will be more than compensated by the efficiency gains and therefore the growth gains that come in the future. But let us accept that because of the limited nature of the GST we have today, both of those are going to be lower than what we would have had under an ideal GST.
All right, so it's not yet an ideal GST, as you're saying. It's a beginning of a process, and which perhaps makes the entire debate, which I'm sure you've been hearing about, the celebrations that are taking place tonight. And again, as with everything, there would be two ways of looking at it. One is to say, look, this is not a perfect GST right now, start of a process. Let's do it in a slightly low-key manner. And the second is to say, well, at least the entire political class, the center and all states got together and they pushed through the beginning of a major reform, if not a reform. And it is, even in its own form, a pretty major reform. So we should celebrate it, have a special session of Parliament and the rest of it. Which side of the fence on that would you be?
Oh yes, absolutely. It's the beginning of a process. It's a process that's been pending for a long time. And yes, we should celebrate the beginning of that process.
All right, we should celebrate the beginning of the process. Professor Bibek Debroy, thank you so much for joining us with that perspective.